Good evening, good vach shavua tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Joe in the Inland Empire, Bell in Texas, Gail in Kansas City, Frank in San Pedro, Chaim in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Lester in Florida. Welcome everybody. Starting a new Mishna. Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 8 of Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud. Our daf tonight is page 78, short daf. And we begin this at the very bottom of page 77b. Mishnah 5. In the case of blood of an offering fit for sacrifice that was mixed with water. Right? So it's the blood of a sacrifice when the temple is standing in Jerusalem, which hasn't in 2,000 years. When an offering was brought, the animal would be slaughtered, its blood collected in a service vessel, conveyed to the altar, and sprinkled on the sides or corners of the altar, depending on the type of offering. But it's that blood being sprinkled on the altar, also called the presentation of blood on the altar, that would actually achieve the goal of the sacrifice, whether fulfilling an obligatory offering like a sin offering or a guilt offering, or fulfilling a vow that somebody vowed to bring, a burnt offering or a peace offering. The objective would be accomplished when that blood was presented on the altar. We've been talking about if there's been mixtures or intermingling, for example, of animals that were designated to be different kinds of offerings that were mixed together, and we don't know which animal is which. How do we deal with that situation? Now, in this Mishnah, we're talking about mixtures involving elements of the sacrifice, not the animals themselves, but here the blood that's been collected, and before it reaches the altar, somehow it became intermingled with something else, and how are we going to deal with that situation? So in the case of blood of an offering that is fit for sacrifice, right, there's not a problem with the offering itself, so that blood should make its way to the altar, but on the way, it was mixed with water. So, if the mixture has the appearance of blood, it is fit for sprinkling on the altar, even though the majority of the mixture is water. So it seems like water doesn't get in the way as long as it looks like blood. If the blood was mixed with red wine, one views the wine as though it is water. If that amount of water would leave the mixture with the appearance of blood, it is fit for presentation. Right? And why would this be? Because the blood or the wine in this situation almost becomes a carrier, but you remember there's no minimum amount, at least according to some opinions, of blood that has to reach the altar. So blood reached the altar, and it was mixed with something that didn't change the fact that blood reached the altar. And likewise, if the blood, wait a minute, see. Yes, and likewise, if the blood was mixed with the blood of a non-sacred domesticated animal, or the blood of a non-sacred undomesticated animal, one considers the non-sacred blood as though it is water. It didn't invalidate the fact that the blood of an offering actually reached the altar, so the fact that it was mixed with other blood that was not an offering, somehow just like the blood that was of an animal that was kosher for eating, that maybe the priests were going to have for lunch that day, and some of that blood got mixed with the blood of an offering, it doesn't change the fact that blood of the offering reached the altar, and the fact that non-sacred blood also made its way to the altar is not going to invalidate the presentation of the blood of the offering. And so Rabbi Yehuda says blood does not nullify blood. Therefore, the priest presents the blood of the mixture on the altar. Now we're on 78a. If blood fit for presentation was mixed with the blood of unfit offerings, now we have a problem, and there in fact is no remedy. Therefore, the entire mixture shall be poured into the drain running through the temple courtyard. Because in this case, you have blood of a fit offering that should go to the altar, but it was mixed with blood of an unfit offering, an offering that was disqualified for some reason, that blood should not go to the altar. So even though it means that the blood of a fit offering will have to be thrown out, that's what you're going to have to do with this mixture. Therefore, the entire mixture shall be poured into the drain running through the temple courtyard. And likewise, if blood fit for presentation was mixed with blood of exudate. What's exudate? I.e., the blood that exudes from the neck after the initial spurt following its slaughter concludes. That blood is unfit for presentation, and therefore the entire mixture shall be poured into the temple courtyard drain. Right? This exudate, what we're talking about is, what is the blood that is fit to be presented on the altar? We start with an offering that is fit. It was not blemished. It was not disqualified. The priest didn't bring it with an error of intention. He knew what kind of offering was presented. He had that offering in mind. He knew who the owner was, and he had that owner in mind. So no other mistakes were made. The blood, so when they slaughter the animal, if it's a mammal, right, they slaughter the animal and blood pours out and the animal dies, right? The animal bleeds out. So that initial spurt of blood by which the animal dies, that's called blood of the soul, and consistent with the idea that says the blood is the life elsewhere in the Torah. And it's that blood, the blood through which the animal died, that is presented on the altar. Now, the animal, after it dies, still has blood in the carcass. If that blood is then collected in a vessel and presented on the altar, that would be a transgression because that's not blood of the soul. That after blood, so to speak, does not get presented on the altar. And if there's a mixture of blood of the soul with this exudate, this later blood, then that mixture needs to be thrown out because that later blood is not fit for presentation on the altar. Rabbi Eliezer deems this mixture fit for presentation, even according to the first Tana, if the priest did not consult the authorities and place the blood on the altar, the offering is fit. In other words, ab initio, that mixture should not be presented on the altar, but if the priest went ahead and did it anyway, we don't retroactively disqualify the offering and say that whoever brought that offering needs to bring another offering. After the fact, it's considered qualified. But if the priest were to consult with a halakhic authority before bringing that mixture, we would tell him no. Now the Gemara on Mishna 5. The Mishnah teaches that in a case where water became mixed with the blood of an offering, if the mixture has the appearance of blood, it is fit, despite the fact that there is more water than blood, right? Even if it's majority water, as long as you can tell that that's blood in the water, and we know there's blood in there that's fit, the water doesn't disqualify it. Therefore, we sprinkle from that mixture onto the altar. Now, concerning this, Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says they taught this law only in a case where the water fell into the blood. How was this mixture achieved? Water fell into the blood. But in a case where the blood fell into the water, what would be different about that? So, and they're going to explain it. It is nullified. But in a case where the blood fell into the water, the first drop of blood and then the next drop of blood is nullified in the water. I.e., when blood falls into water, I mean, if you could slow it down to slow motion, right, it'd be one drop of blood falling into the water at a time, even though it's much faster than that. And so therefore, each drop is nullified in turn. Consequently, the mixture is unfit for presentation regardless of whether it has the appearance of blood. Interesting ruling, right? That because if the blood falls into the water, technically it falls in one drop at a time, and each drop is nullified by the much larger volume of water. Therefore, even though a bunch of blood ends up in the water, we say that that mixture is not fit for presentation on the altar. Rav Papa says, but with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood, now we're not talking about sacrifices at all. When you're talking about just kosher animals that are slaughtered for eating, so there's a difference between domesticated and undomesticated animals, right? Domesticated, the cows, the sheep, the goats that are raised on a farm. And when the time comes to eat them, they're shechted, right? That means kosher slaughter, particular kind of cutting the throat, and very sharp knife, one smooth cut, etc. That animal bleeds out. And then we examine the animal to make sure it's not a treifa, it didn't have some kind of a wound by which it would have died within 12 months. And if it doesn't have that, so now that animal is ready for kosher butchering, where we're going to remove certain parts of the animal that we don't eat, and the rest can be eaten by Jews. If it's an undomesticated kosher animal, that would include, for example, a deer. Deer is a kosher animal, but it's not domesticated. You have to go out in the wild and get it. You can't shoot it. You can't shoot it with an arrow nor with a gun. The only way that you would be able to end up eating that animal is if you could trap it in a way that doesn't harm it and then shecht it. And then there's an additional mitzvah that applies to undomesticated kosher mammals and also applies to even domesticated kosher birds, which is that when the blood, you're slaughtering the animal, so it bleeds out, as we've been saying, and the blood spills on the ground, and then the Torah specifies explicitly that you have to cover that blood with earth. We don't have that commandment for kosher domesticated animals, but for undomesticated animals, you have to bring earth and cover that blood. So that's what we're talking about here. But with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood of birds or undomesticated animals that are slaughtered, it is not so. Meaning whether the blood fell into water or the water fell into the blood to create this mixture, either way, the mitzvah of covering the blood when you slaughtered a kosher bird or a kosher undomesticated animal, that you have to cover it with earth, you still have to do it even if that blood is mixed with water. And even if the blood fell into the water, it's not nullified the way it would be for an offering, right? Because there are greater stringencies for the laws of offerings. And here it ends up being a leniency, but it's a greater stringency that it gets nullified, and therefore we don't present it on the altar. Whereas for the mitzvah of covering, we say it is not nullified, and therefore we have to bring the earth. It results in a stringency, but it comes from a leniency. Right, Rav Papa says, but with regard to the mitzvah of covering the blood of birds or undomesticated animals that are slaughtered, it is not so. In this case, even if the blood fell into the water, the mitzvah of covering applies to it, provided that the mixture has the appearance of blood. The blood is not nullified by the water because there is no permanent rejection with regard to mitzvahs, i.e., its nullification was merely temporary, but once there is enough blood in the water, it reassumes the status of blood, and since you poured enough blood into the water that it has the appearance of blood, you have to cover it with earth. Next topic, the Gemara continues to discuss various mixtures. Reish Lakish says, with regard to meat of pigul, which we've discussed a lot of times in this tractate, pigul is a condition that results when, at the time that an offering is slaughtered in the Holy Temple, the person slaughtering it, or at the time that its blood is collected, or the blood is being conveyed, or the blood is being sprinkled, the priest has in mind, or the person slaughtering has in mind, to consume some of the meat of that offering. If it's a burnt offering, consume means place it on the altar, or if it's a sin offering, that the priests are going to eat it. And at the time that the procedure is being done, they have in their minds that they're going to eat that meat beyond the deadline. It's kind of a weird intention to have, but if he has such an intention, then that offering is already disqualified. We don't continue the process. And if somebody then eats the meat of that offering, knowing that it was rendered pigul, and he does it intentionally, he's subject to karas, death at the hands of the heavenly court. As opposed to nosar, which is basically the same result, but not with intention from the outset. Rather, the offering was brought properly, was slaughtered properly, the blood was presented on the altar properly, and so now the meat is available either to be consumed as a burnt offering on the altar or consumed by the priest if it's a sin offering, but they end up doing it beyond the deadline of, the day it was slaughtered plus the following night. That's the deadline. If they eat it beyond that deadline, then they have violated a prohibition. If they do it intentionally, they're subject to lashes. That's the difference between pigul, where the intent at the outset renders the meat prohibited, versus nosar, the meat ended up being left over beyond its designated deadline. So, Reish Lakish says, with regard to the meat of pigul, i.e. an offering that was sacrificed with the intent to consume its blood, to consume it beyond its designated time, and the meat of nosar, an offering whose designated time for consumption has passed, and tameh, sacrificial meat, right? Meat that somehow became impure, ritually impure, came into contact with a source of impurity, each of which was an olive bulk, the minimum size for which one is liable to be flogged for its consumption. So if you had meat that was pigul, nosar, or became tameh, right, in all three cases, you can't eat it. But then somebody mixed it together and ate them as a mixture. Okay, so all three are prohibited, but somebody mixed them together and ate them as a mixture. Interesting ruling, he is exempt from being flogged, right? If he ate any one of them, he would be flogged. Pigul, he could even be, I guess pigul, we would flog him, even though there's also death at the hands of the heavenly court. But certainly for nosar, pigul, I don't think we flog. But for nosar and tameh, which he did intentionally, we flog, assuming there was a warning. He was told, if you eat that, you'll be liable to get lashes. And he does it anyway, right after he receives the warning. But in this case, if all three are mixed together, he is exempt from being flogged. And the reason is that it is impossible while eating them that one type would not be greater than another type and nullify it. Since it is unknown which prohibition will nullify the other, one cannot forewarn the offender as to which prohibition he is about to transgress. And in order to be liable to be flogged, one must receive a forewarning concerning a specific prohibition. So even if we were going to flog for eating pigul, the fact is you don't know whether the meat that you're eating is going to violate pigul or nosar, or eating tameh basar, meat that is tameh. So since you don't know which particular prohibition you're violating, the warning is not effective, and therefore he is exempt from being flogged. Now the Gemara comments conclude three laws from this statement of Reish Lakish. Conclude from it that prohibitions nullify one another in a majority, just as permitted items nullify a prohibited item. And conclude from it that the law that when a prohibited food imparts flavor to a permitted substance, it prohibits it, even when the permitted substance is the majority, that this does not apply by Torah law, but by rabbinic law. And the proof is that this principle was applied, but the proof is that if this principle were applied by Torah law, then one should be flogged for this consumption, as the meats are of different types, and therefore one of them must have imparted flavor to the other. And finally, conclude from it that an uncertain forewarning, for example, one in which the witness cannot be sure which prohibition the transgressor is about to violate, is not considered a forewarning at all. Now, concerning the inference that the law that when a prohibited food imparts flavor to a permitted substance, it prohibits it, even when the permitted substance is the majority, does not apply by Torah law, Rava raises an objection to that from a Mishna in Challah 3:7. In a case where one prepared a dough from wheat and from rice. Okay, so what they're talking about here is if you're making bread from wheat, and you make a sufficient quantity, which is quite a bit actually. I think you have to do like 5 pounds of flour and make all the bread from that. And then the mitzvah of challah applies. Now, normally we think of challah as the word for the bread that we eat on Friday nights with our Shabbos dinner. And it's true that we call that challah. But what the word challah actually means in halacha, right, in Jewish law, is the obligation to remove some of the dough from the dough that you're going to use to cook all this bread, right? 5 pounds of flour, you're going to turn that into bread, bunch of loaves. But at the time that it's still dough, you have to separate a portion of that dough and give it to a priest, a Kohen. These days, we don't do that. We can't give it to a Kohen. But if a woman who's making, challah for her family is making enough challah, she separates some of that dough and puts it aside, and then later it has to be disposed of respectfully through burning. So challah is the mitzvah of removing dough if you have a minimum quantity of dough because you're making bread. That's the key. Now we're talking about mixtures of permitted and not permitted things relative to certain kinds of commandments. So in this case, we have the obligation to separate challah from this minimum measure of wheat-based dough for bread. But what if the dough had a mixture of wheat and rice? Then are we obligated in challah? So Rava raises an objection from a Mishna in a case where one prepared a dough from wheat and from rice. If this mixture has the taste of wheat, it is obligated in the mitzvah of challah, a portion of dough that must be given to a priest. Challah is separated only from one of the 5 species of grain, which do not include rice, right? So that's wheat, oats, spelt, barley, and rye, I believe. Interesting, by the way, that rice, where does rice come from? The Far East, right? Asia, where you think it comes from. What was rice doing in Israel, right? In the Middle East and in Babel, in Babylonia? Answer, by Talmudic times, rice was being grown in the Holy Land. So, now Rav explains his objection. And this law applies even though the majority of the mixture is flour from rice. So even though most of the dough is made from rice, if there's enough wheat in it to impart the flavor of wheat bread to the dough, then you are obligated in challah. So sounds like as long as taste is imparted, even though it's in the minority, the mitzvah is going to apply to it. Apparently, the fact that the wheat imparts flavor to the dough renders it obligated in challah, even if the wheat is the minority. So now the Gemara answers the obligation to set aside challah in this case applies by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. Well, Rava challenges this and says, if so, say that the latter clause of that same Mishnah, a person can fulfill his obligation with matzah from this type of dough on the first night of Pesach. That's surprising, right? Really? Now, during Passover, during the 8 days of Passover, we cannot eat leavened bread, right? We can only eat unleavened bread, i.e. matzah. And by the way, matzah in ancient times was not the crisp cracker that, the crisp type of flatbread that cracks and breaks when you bend it. It was actually soft challah, more similar to, like with laffa bread or tortillas type of thing, right? A flat, soft bread. At any rate, you cannot eat leavened bread during Pesach, Passover. You can only eat unleavened bread. But you're not commanded to eat matzah other than on the first night. On the first night, it's an obligation for Jews to eat matzah. Thereafter, you don't have to eat matzah, but if you eat bread, it needs to be matzah. Okay, since by Torah law, this mitzvah must be fulfilled with matzah made from a grain, right? One of the 5 grains, not rice. So evidently, the principle that one substance that imparts flavor to a greater amount of a different substance affects its status, this must apply by Torah law, since it's a Torah law that we have to eat matzah on the first night. So if you can fulfill it with this mixture, this dough made of wheat and rice, where rice is the majority, but it tastes like wheat, sounds like that works by Torah law, not just by rabbinic law. Now we're on 78b. So rather, one must say that according to Reish Lakish, in a case of a type of food mixed with food not of its own type, such as wheat flour and rice flour, whose tastes are different, the status is determined by not the quantities, but the flavor. If the flavor is of one type, that's the kind of laws you're going to follow. Therefore, if the dough tastes like wheat, it has the law of dough made from wheat. But if it is a type of food mixed with food of its own type, for example, a mixture of pigul and nosar meat, which is the case addressed by Reish Lakish, then the status of the mixture is determined by the majority. And the Gemara suggests, but let us estimate in a case of a type of food mixed with food of its own type, as though it were a mixture of a type of food mixed with food not of its own type. And if so, the minority is not nullified if it is substantial enough to impart flavor to the majority. As we learned in the Mishna, if the blood of an offering was mixed with wine, one considers it as though it is water, the wine. Although the blood and wine certainly have different flavors, in the case of the Mishnah, the determinative factor is not the taste of the mixture, not that we would ever taste it, but the appearance. Since they share the same appearance, they're considered a case of a substance in contact with the same type of substance. And what? Is it not correct to explain the Mishnah as stating that one views the wine as though it is water, i.e. a substance of a different type, and if the mixture would have the appearance of blood, if the wine were water, it is fit for presentation despite the fact that blood is not the majority? And the Gemara answers, no, that analysis is not right. This is not the explanation of the Mishnah. Rather, it means that one views the blood as though it is water, i.e., it is unfit for presentation, since it is as though one presented water on the altar. Whereas wine can be presented, it is a libation, water is not presented on the altar. And the Gemara questions this explanation. Well, if so, the Tana of the Mishnah should have said the blood is nullified. And furthermore, it is taught in the Baraisa with regard to a ritually impure bucket containing a certain amount of white wine or milk that one immersed in a ritual bath. Okay, here we're talking about a mikvah. Usually we talk about a mikvah as a ritual bath in which a person who has become tameh immerses in order to be purified from that. These days mikvah still exists. There are only two kinds of immersion in a mikvah that are obligatory. That is a woman who is observing the family purity laws. So after her menses end and she observes a week of clean days, then she immerses in the mikvah to be purified of menstrual tumah, and then she and her husband become permitted to each other again. Mikvah night. Or a person who converts to Judaism, when she finishes their conversion, they immerse in a mikvah. In both of these cases, they say a blessing, a bracha, over the immersion because it's an obligatory immersion. Jewish men, immerse in mikvah all the time, but they don't say a bracha because it's not obligatory. It's more of a custom. That is a person immersing a mikvah. We also have what's known as the toivel mikvah. And that's not for people, that's for utensils. So when you bring a utensil, plates, glasses, silverware, cooking utensils, into a Jewish home, so they're coming from out in the world where they were manufactured and transported by non-Jews, and now you're going to bring it into a Jewish home, it first has to be toiveled, it has to be immersed in a mikvah, so that it sort of, becomes Jewish, as it were, comes into the status of being part of a Jewish home. That's an obligatory immersion, and there is a blessing that we say for that. Now, when we toivel a utensil, so I've had to do this many times, especially when Passover is approaching and we're getting new things that you need that year, or whenever you bring, you get a new set of glasses or forks or whatever. Not plastic, but if it's wood, metal, or glass, or ceramic, you're going to take it to the toivel mikvah, and every bit of the utensil has to come into contact with the water of the mikvah. So something that you might do is, like with a plate, you put it in with your right hand, and then transfer it to your left hand underwater. So the part where you're holding it wasn't in contact with the water until you removed your hand from it. And now the whole thing is in contact with the water. Sometimes you put it in a basket, like there's a bunch of knives and forks and stuff, kind of shake it around a little bit, and now it came into contact with water. What they're saying here is, let's say you have a bowl, and you're going to toivel the bowl, but the bowl has liquid in it before you put it into the mikvah. So it's considered that the liquid that's in the bowl is actually going to interpose between the bowl and the water of the mikvah. And so that toiveling, that immersion in the mikvah will not be effective. You have to deal with that situation. So what's going on? And furthermore, it is taught in a baraisa with regard to a tameh bucket that you're gonna purify, you're gonna make it tahor, containing a certain amount of white wine or milk that one immersed in a mikvah. Rabbi Yehuda says, although the appearance of the white wine or milk is not discernible in the water of the mikvah that enters the bucket, one views the white wine or milk as though it is red wine and makes the following determination. If its conjectured red appearance would pale due to the water that enters the bucket, the wine or the milk is nullified by the water. Therefore, the act of purification is fit and the bucket is ritually pure. The immersion worked. But if its conjectured red appearance, right, if the milk or the white wine were red wine, and if it was, right, if there was so much in it that when you added water from the mikvah, it would still be discernibly red wine in it, then the immersion did not work. The purification is unfit and the bucket remains tameh. This is a case in which a substance was mixed with another substance of a similar appearance, as white wine and milk have a similar appearance to water, and yet it is treated as a mixture of a substance with a different type of substance, and it is not nullified in a majority, but rather you have to do this color test, even if it's a hypothetical color test. So the Gemara explains, one cannot cite a proof from the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as this is a dispute between Tanaim, the sages of the Mishna. And the ruling follows the opinion of the rabbis, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in that baraisa with regard to a ritually impure tameh bucket in which there is white wine or milk, and one immersed it in a mikvah, one follows the majority, i.e. if the majority of the contents of the bucket is now water from the mikvah, it is pure. And Rabbi Yehuda says one views the white wine or milk as though it is red wine and makes the following determination, what I just said, if its conjectured red appearance would pale due to the water that enters the bucket, the act of purification is fit and the bucket is pure, but if its conjectured red appearance would not pale, the act of purification is unfit and the bucket remains ritually impure, even if the majority of the contents after this immersion would be water rather than the white wine or milk. But the rabbis overruled Rabbi Yehuda. And so now the Gemara raises a contradiction to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda from a Mishna in mikvah 10:6. If one had an impure bucket that is filled with spittle, right, spit, and one immersed it in a mikvah, the spittle is considered an interposition between the water of the mikvah and that of the bucket, and therefore it is as though he did not immerse it, right? It would disqualify the immersion. And if the impure bucket was full of urine and he immersed it, although urine is slightly different in appearance than water, one views the urine as though it is water, and therefore once the urine is in contact with the mikvah, it is considered connected to the water, and it is not an interposition preventing the bucket from becoming ritually pure. A surprising thing. I guess because even though urine is, disgusting, and there are many things that because they're disgusting create a certain result. Here, I guess because the urine is primarily water, which it is, it's considered part of the water. Now the Mishnah continues, if the impure bucket was filled with water of purification, the bucket is not purified until the water of the mikvah that enters the bucket becomes greater in quantity than the water of purification it contains, thereby nullifying it in a majority. Fascinating ruling. The urine does not present a problem, but water purification does. What's water purification? That's water used to purify a person who is tameh with corpse tumah. But it's a particular kind of water. That was pure water mixed with ashes of the red heifer. It has a specific purpose, not toiveling utensils and purifying utensils, but rather purifying a person of corpse tumah. So in this case, they're going to be extra stringent because the water purification looks exactly like the water, right? When things are too similar, the sages are more stringent because you won't catch it unless you're being very careful. Now, the Gemara explains the contradiction. Whom have you heard who accepts this reasoning of one views, which appears in this Mishnah with regard to urine? That's Rabbi Yehuda, as stated in the baraisa cited above. And yet the Mishnah teaches that a majority suffices to nullify the water of purification that became mixed with water, and it is not considered as though it is red wine. This conflicts with the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda with regard to white wine and milk. And Abaye says, this is not difficult. La kasha. And I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And we're at the top of 79a. So this statement that the water of purification is nullified in a majority of water is his, i.e. Rabbi Yehuda's own opinion. Whereas that statement in the Baraisa that white wine is not nullified in a majority of water is a ruling that he is transmitting in the name of his teacher, Rabban Gamliel, who is stringent with regard to a mixture of a substance in contact with the same type of substance. So even though Rabbi Yehuda might not have held that way on his own, he's transmitting the teaching of his teacher. As it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabban Gamliel, blood does not nullify blood, spittle does not nullify spittle, and urine does not nullify urine. Rava says there is a different resolution of the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah that states that water purification is nullified in a majority of water of a mikvah and Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in the Baraisa with regard to white wine mixed with water. In the Mishnah, we are dealing with a bucket whose internal surface is ritually pure and only its external surface is impure. It came into contact with something on the outside, but that tuma didn't, pass into the interior of the bucket. And the significance of this is that by Torah law, it suffices for the water of the mikvah to enter the bucket in any amount to purify its external surface, and therefore the water purification in the bucket does not prevent the purification of the bucket at all. And Rava continues, and it is the sages who decreed with regard to this case of the internal surface, it is the sages who decreed with regard to this case that the internal surface must be purified as well, lest the owner wish to spare the water of purification and not nullify it from its sanctity. In that case, he would wish, to save himself from nullifying the water of purification, which is rare and very dear. I wouldn't even say expensive. You couldn't purchase it, but it was very dear, and so he might want to save it in a situation where he should not be thinking about saving it if he wants to purify that vessel. And that's why they issued this stringent decree. And remember, we're not going deep on these laws of mikvah and purifying vessels because we're only citing those laws in passing for us to talk about our subject, which is when do mixtures of liquids get nullified or not nullified. So it is the sages who decreed with regard to this case that the internal surface of the bucket must be purified as well, lest the owner wish to spare the water of purification and not to nullify it from its sanctity. In that case, he would wish to avoid allowing water from the ritual bath, the mikvah, to enter the vessel and might immerse it in a manner which would not allow even the full external surface to come into contact with the water. Therefore, the sages required that one immerse the entire vessel. But once there is a majority of water in the bucket from the mikvah, he does not need to enable any more water to enter the vessel, as by Torah law it is already pure, and presumably the water of purification would have been nullified. It is no longer water of purification because water from the mikvah got mixed into it. That's where we'll knock off. Take a few questions and comments. Bill. So the problem, as I understand it, is that the blood is more viscous than water and therefore goes out in drops or globules compared to water, which goes out in laminar flows, so it's all one thing. Have I got that right? I would actually say no. And the reason is that if water falls into the blood, it also is nullified one drop at a time. But that doesn't bother us because what we want is the blood to remain blood that can be presented on the altar. Whereas if blood goes into the water and the blood is nullified one drop at a time, then we don't have blood which we can present on the altar, and that's why we wouldn't sprinkle it on the altar. Whereas since it's nullified, but then eventually we find that there's a majority of blood in that mixture, it doesn't become permanently rejected from the mitzvah, And that's why we would still have to cover that mixture if it came from the slaughter of an undomesticated kosher animal. We'd have to cover it with earth. But with regard to presenting it on the altar, since it got nullified one drop at a time, we now consider that we don't really have any blood, and even though it ends up being a majority of the mixture is blood, there is permanent nullification with respect to presentation toward the altar that we don't have with respect to the mitzvah of covering the blood. Sharon, is the punishment of nosar applicable if the prohibited meat was eaten out of extreme hunger? What an interesting question. So he knew it was nosar, right? He has to do it intentionally for flogging to apply. But I would say that when you're talking about extreme hunger, I mean, what you're saying to me is he needs to save his life, right? It's pikuach nefesh. Once he's doing it to save his life, then I can't imagine there would be flogging. Because, we override Shabbos, we desecrate Shabbos to save a life. I would think that we'll probably override nosar to save a life as well. If you're telling me that he's like, oh, I'm starving, he's just so hungry, but he knows that he's eating meat that was deemed nosar, then I think, and he was warned, etc., and he did it anyway, I think probably the flogging would apply. If he was just so hungry that he instinctively reached for it and ate it, and didn't realize it was nosar, well, then he wasn't warned, and since he didn't realize, he must not have been warned, and then flogging wouldn't apply anyway. Michelle says, Ray, the bowl, how about wiping it out with a clean cloth towel, then immersion fresh from cleaning from the... Yes, absolutely. That is what we do, right? They're just talking about if you made a mistake and there was liquid in it when you immersed it, did that immersion count or not? Like, let's say somebody didn't know this law, they immersed it with stuff in it because they thought it didn't matter. Later, they asked the question, there was liquid in it. Was my immersion valid or not? Then maybe in some of these cases it would not be. But absolutely, what you normally do is make sure that there is no interposition between whatever you're immersing, whether it's a person or a vessel, and the waters of the mikvah, including... when you're buying new things, right, there's price tags on it. That has to be removed or the immersion is not valid. By the way, I just saw a video that could be incredibly useful to people. Like when you buy new stuff, especially ceramic, like plates and bowls and mugs, and they have from Cost Plus or somewhere that price or Target, and the price tag is so sticky and you're peeling it with your thumbnail and some of the glue remains and it's really a pain in the butt to get all of it off. So I saw a video that seems like if you take packing tape and you just, put a layer of tape over the price tag completely and, a bunch more on the bowl, and then you press the tape into the price tag and then you just peel off the tape, the price tag will come off with it. Really easy way to remove a price tag. Great tip, right? And finally, Joseph, was there any practice of mixing blood and water deliberately for any reason and to be sure it doesn't disqualify? I can't think of any situation where they mix blood and water on purpose, right? There's a saying that's eluding me right now about blood and water. Is it something about it basically means that family, is a bond that can't be broken, something like that with blood and water. But I can't think of a situation where they mix blood and water on purpose. Generally speaking, they need to keep those things separate, right? We don't want to mix anything into the blood of an offering that's going to be presented on the altar. Where blood and water end up getting mixed is when they're washing the temple floor after there's been slaughter there, especially after Passover. There's a lot of blood on the ground, and they're going to end up, what there was? And then the blood goes down the drain. This is where there's a mixture. The blood goes down the drain, And then it goes down and out into the river that's in that little valley at the foot of the Temple Mount. Right now, that's a little valley that's between the Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives and an Arab cemetery that's at the foot, be sort of behind the Temple Mount. And there was like a little river that went through there. And blood from offerings would go down the drain and mix into that water. And we learned elsewhere, I remember this right in the Gemara, that if farmers wanted to use that water, which had blood, it ends up being a fertilizer. And so if they wanted to sort of take some of that water and use it to water crops because it's a stronger fertilizer, there was a question of whether that's me'ila or not. Right, making personal benefit from something that was consecrated, because that was the blood of offerings. And as I recall, there was some nuance to that ruling, but in certain situations, they're not permitted to take that because it would be me'ila, but according to other opinions, it's already been sort of used and discarded, and they could use it. So as I recall, there were different opinions on that. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday night at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night and a good week. Good vach, Shavua Tov.